The winter of 1943 pressed down on the Baltic coast like a hand determined to smother every trace of warmth. The small inlet was drowned in its usual curtain of fog, a living thing that curled between rocks, chimneys, and the crooked ribs of abandoned boats. Even at mid-morning, the light was a sickly gray of early dawn, and the air smelled of brine, rust, and old wood saturated with decades of storms. In that cold haze, Elias Rossio mended his nets beside the hull of the skiff. Fingers numb, shoulders stiff beneath layers of patchwool. Each knotty tide felt like a small punishment, measured and familiar, the way guilt often was. His brother's face still appeared to him in flashes. Those last seconds before a German armor patrol dragged a boy into their half-track. The memory lingered like the fog, always present, always damp, always cold. Elias lived quietly now, blending into the background of the village as easily as smoke disappearing into the night sky. The local officers, both German and a few collaborators, treated him like a piece of furniture, useful when carrying crates, invisible the rest of the time. They had no idea how deeply he knew this land. He understood every slippery path leading into the pine forest, every treacherous mud channel exposed at low tide, every hidden sandbank where engines sometimes died without explanation. No formal map ever captured what Elias held in his head. It was a lifetime of listening to the sea, of measuring the world by scent, texture, and tide. That morning, the mist trembled with a new sound, metal rolling over frozen earth. A deep mechanical growl. Elias paused, the net sagging between his hands. He knew that sound. Everyone did. The villagers emerged onto porches and thresholds, silhouettes swallowed by fog. A column of German panzers approached from the east, treads grinding like jaws chewing stone. The first tank's turret cut through the whiteness before its hull became visible, and then a second, a third, an entire procession. Their arrival felt monstrous, inevitable, like the tide reversing itself in an instant. The tanks halted near the harbor road, engines idling with low menace that vibrated through the wooden docks. Soldiers spilled out, barking orders, pointing toward the shoreline. Elias didn't need to hear the words to understand the intention. The bay, his bay, was about to become a supply point. The village, already quiet and threadbare, would be swallowed whole. Once the port was blocked, no fishing boat would leave without permission. No food would arrive. No one would escape. Elias felt an old instinct stir in him, something he thought he had buried with his brother's memory. He looked toward the shipyard's far end, where the oldest dry dock lay in use, its gates swollen by decades of salt. Beneath it ran a forgotten drainage trench, one only the oldest fisherman remembered. And Elias, through years of helping his father repair hulls, knew the entire system. The warp beams, the stubborn bolts, the way the water could be redirected if someone dared to tamper with the rusted mechanism. It was a child's memory sharpened by a man's desperation. A plan formed, not fully, not clearly, but dangerously enough to feel real. It was insane, reckless. A soldier wouldn't try it. An officer wouldn't imagine it. But Elias was not a soldier, and he had no rank to protect, only a village to lose. And perhaps, in the hollow part of his chest, he never spoke about something to avenge. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and touched the simple iron key he kept there, the one tool he had carried since boyhood. $3 worth of metal, worthless to most, but not to him, not here. The fog thickened around him as he stood, as if the inlet itself held its breath, waiting for whatever he would choose next. The fog settled heavier as afternoon crept in, thick enough that Elias felt as though he were pushing through wet wool. The German soldiers moved like ghosts in the grayness, their shapes appearing and vanishing between the stacks of nets and abandoned crab traps. Orders echoed bluntly, short, sharp commands cut by coughing engines and the clatter of tools. The panzers were spreading out, forming a chain along the harbor road, securing the high ground, blocking the pier. Each metallic click of a rifle bolt seemed to tighten the noose around the village. Elias kept his head down. Fishermen were supposed to look small, powerless, unimportant. He let his eyes remain half-lowered as he moved along the boardwalk, but inside, his mind churned with precise measurements. Tide cycle, water pressure, torque on the ancient bolts, soil saturation beneath the pasadizo. Years ago, his father had warned him that the old shipyard gate would one day collapse under its own weight. Elias had laughed then, young and careless, never imagining the knowledge would become a weapon. A soldier stopped him near the smoker's shack. The German's breath came out in white bursts as he eyed Elias suspiciously. Elias responded with a shrug, lifting the coil of rope over his shoulder like a submissive laborer. The soldier grunted and waved him off. That single moment confirmed what Elias already suspected. No one saw him as a threat. No one imagined a man with cracked hands and salt-hardened boots could alter anything in this war. He made his way toward the far end of the shipyard. Each step was a struggle against mud stiffened by frost, the ground uneven beneath a growing crust of ice. As he approached the old dry dock, the fog thinned enough for him to see its silhouette. A towering wooden gate with rust crawling along its hinges like dead ivy. The rails on either side were warped, half swallowed by dirt. Most people assumed the structure hadn't worked in decades, but Elias remembered helping his father grease the upper joint one summer. Remembered the surprising strength still hidden inside the swollen frame. He crouched beside the gate, letting his fingers brush the enormous bolts, cold, stubborn metal that had resisted repair crews for years. He pulled out the iron key, small and anonymous in his palm. Its teeth were worn smooth, but they fit perfectly into the maintenance latch that controlled the pressure release. Only someone who had practically grown up inside the shipyard would know that. Elias hesitated. The idea still felt absurd. He was one man. The tanks were giants. And yet he knew the terrain. He knew the tide. Knowledge like that, when aimed precisely, could be sharper than any blade. He slipped the key into the slot. The first turn resisted, metal complaining with a scream so faint he worried the soldiers might hear. He paused, listening. Nothing. Only the hum of engines somewhere behind the fog. He braced his shoulder against the beam, using his full weight as he twisted again. The bolt shifted, barely, grudgingly. A second twist. A third. And then the mechanism loosened. Water responded instantly. A low groan echoed through wood as pressure changed within the dry dock channels. Elias felt the vibration travel through his boots, through his bones. The tide would begin diverting soon, slow at first, then stronger, pouring toward the forgotten trench under the Pasadizo. It would eat at the soil from beneath, turn it soft, turn it treacherous. He checked the alignment, adjusting a second bolt until he felt a distinct shudder of water finding a new path. It was working. It was actually working. Footsteps echoed somewhere to the north, closer now. Elias froze, breath held, heart hammering. A pair of German voices murmured through the fog. Boots scraped against frozen planks. He couldn't run. Movement would give him away. Instead, he crouched lower, becoming another shadow among shadows. The soldiers passed only meters away. One laughed about something, the sound abrupt and careless. Neither even glanced toward the obsolete gate. Minutes stretched. Only when the footsteps dissolved into the fog did Elias stand again. The diversion was underway. A tremor of fear went through him. Fear of being caught. Fear of failing. Fear of what would happen to the villagers if this plan collapsed. But below all that sat a colder, heavier feeling. Resolve. Not courage. Not heroism. Simply the quiet certainty that no one else would act, and therefore he had to. He tightened his coat against the wind and prepared to set the next stage in motion. Twilight seeped into the inlet without changing the light at all. The fog swallowed every hint of dusk, leaving the world suspended in the same dull gray that seemed to belong to no hour. Elias moved along the shoreline as quietly as a man could while carrying a plan heavy enough to split his chest. The tide had already begun shifting through the altered channels, and though the change was subtle, he could sense it. The faint tremble in the planks, the sharper smell of churned brine rising from beneath the docks. The shipyard itself felt alive, as if it too were waking from a long sleep and preparing to help him. The German presence had doubled. More Panzers rolled in from the eastern trail, their treads clattering with the cold assurance of machines that feared nothing. Command posts were being set up near the smokehouse. Lanterns flickered against tarps, casting long spears of light across the mud. Soldiers marched in short, clipped routines. Every clang of metal, every cough of an engine, every shouted order tightened Elias's throat. The village was transforming into a military outpost at terrifying speed. He knew he had only a few hours before the entire column would pass over the narrow wooden pasadizo by the trench. Once the tanks crossed that path, the ground needed to give way instantly. No slow collapse, no partial sink. It had to happen all at once, like a snare closing around prey. If the soil wasn't soft enough by then, if the water hadn't eaten through the foundation, the Panzers would make it across, and the village would be lost. Elias stopped behind a row of overturned dinghies, letting himself breathe. His hands shook, not from cold. He had known cold his entire life, but from the sharp edge of fear he fought to keep buried. He didn't fear dying. He feared failing. The guilt he carried for his brother had carved a hollow place inside him, and now that space demanded something. Action, sacrifice, a price paid forward so someone else's family wouldn't be torn away. A faint splash drew his attention. He stepped closer to the edge of the dock and peered down. The diverted water was rushing through the trench faster now. What had been a thin trickle hours earlier had grown into a hungry stream swirling with sand and mud. The wooden support beams beneath the pasadizo groaned, their old joints softening. Elias crouched, testing the vibration with his fingertips. The soil was loosening. The structure would fail, but only if the Germans moved their heaviest vehicles across the center span. Timing would decide everything. He moved toward the watch point near the eel traps, where he could observe the harbor road without being seen. Soldiers paced along the perimeter, rifles slung casually. A young officer barked orders about reorganizing the column for the night's advance. Elias listened carefully. They planned to reposition the tanks before dawn, moving them across the inlet to secure higher ground on the opposite slope. That meant they would roll across the pasadizo, exactly as he needed. The officer strode off, boots slapping against wood. Elias exhaled slowly. This was the opening. But there was a complication he hadn't counted on. Guards. 2 of them were already assigned to the approach, standing near the narrow path with cigarettes glowing like embers in the fog. If they remained when the tanks advanced, they might detect the instability. If they shouted warnings, if they halted the column for even a moment, the opportunity would vanish. Elias wiped a hand across his mouth. He had never harmed a man, never even raised a fist in anger. Violence was something he had witnessed, never practiced. And yet the war had a way of pushing ordinary people into corners they didn't know existed inside themselves. He thought of his father teaching him to listen to the wind rather than fight it, to bend rather than break. But there were times, rare, terrible times, when bending was not an option. He scanned the shoreline until his eyes settled on the solution, an old stack of lobster crates near the path, each coated in ice. If he could create a distraction, something loud, sudden, and misleading, he could lure the guards away long enough for the tanks to advance unsuspecting. Elias crept toward the crates, each step deliberate. His breath plumed in front of him as he crouched beside them. He studied the angles, the frozen ropes holding the stack together, the tension in the top crate where ice had expanded the wood. With the right pull, the whole structure would collapse and thunder across the dock like a falling mast. His pulse hammered. He wasn't ready. But readiness didn't matter. He slipped his fingers into the gap between 2 crates and braced himself. One breath. Another. He yanked. The crates toppled in a violent cascade, smashing onto planks with a sound that tore through the fog like cannon fire. Shouts erupted from the guards. Elias stepped back into the darkness, unseen. The trap was set. The crash of the falling crates echoed far longer than Elias expected, rolling across the inlet like a drumbeat. Within seconds, the 2 guards abandoned their posts, rifles half raised as they hurried toward the noise. One shouted for reinforcements. Another cursed the idiots who left equipment stacked so carelessly. Their silhouettes dissolved into the fog, leaving the narrow pasadizo unguarded for the first time since the Germans arrived. The silence that followed was unnerving, sharp, expectant, as though the inlet itself were listening for what would come next. Elias crouched behind a row of salt barrels, heart pounding. This was the moment when plans became consequences. Every variable he had calculated, tide speed, soil saturation, would fatigue, would either converge into success or betray him. He felt the familiar pulse of fear rise in his chest, But it was clearer now, cleaner. Fear sharpened him. It made him aware of every distant sound. The faint clank of a tank hatch, the rhythmic stomp of marching boots, the low rumble of idling engines waiting for instructions. A whistle pierced the air. A German officer barked an order. Men scrambled, gathering at the head of the harbor road. Elias could see vague shapes forming a column, the Panzers shifting into motion one by one. Their engines roared with brutal confidence, machines certain of their invincibility. The fog thickened again, smearing the outlines of steel until they looked like great hulking shadows sliding through a dream. Elias ducked lower, peering between two barrels as the first Panzer approached the wooden pasadizo. Its tread strained against the incline, sending vibrations through the planks long before its weight settled on them. Elias felt the tremor travel through the ground and into his bones. He knew this dock. He knew how it groaned under Fisherman hauling a single heavy catch. Now it carried a machine weighing tens of tons. The sound was different, deeper, drawn out, the moan of old beams remembering their limits. The tank reached the midpoint. The soil beneath had already softened to the consistency of a soaked sponge. Water rushed unseen through the trench, nibbling at the earth like thousands of hungry mouths. Elias pressed a hand to the dock, feeling the quiver intensify. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The tank rolled forward another meter, the planks bending but holding, and doubt surged through him. Had the water not moved quickly enough? Had he misjudged the gate's alignment? Had he doomed the village with mistake? Then the earth gave out. It happened in a single violent collapse. A thunderous crack tore through the inlet as the center span of the pasadizo split apart. The front end of the Panzer dropped first, plunging into the cavity below, like a hooked beast dragged beneath the surface. Its tread spun uselessly, kicking up mud and water. The rear end bucked upward before crashing down, sinking deeper as the ground liquefied around it. Shouts erupted from the soldiers on the road. Panic, disbelief, orders all tangled into one frantic roar. Elias didn't move. He barely breathed. He watched the impossible become real. The second tank lurched forward, its driver unable to see clearly through the fog and chaos. It slid onto the weakened planks before anyone could wave him back. Though it snapped instantly, the machine dropped sideways into the trench, crushing what remained of the support beams. Mud surged over the treads, swallowing the wheels. Metal groaned, twisting under its own sinking weight. A third tank braked too late. Its momentum carried it onto the collapsing edge, where the softened soil crumbled beneath it. The vehicle tipped forward, nose first, crashing into growing pit with shriek of tearing steel. Shouts turned into screams. Officers tried to rally the men, yelling to pull back, to regroup, to form perimeter lines. But the inlet betrayed them with every step. The redirected tide surged through the trench, widening the collapse, turning the ground into a churning morass. Soldiers struggled to gain footing, slipping on mud that wasn't mud anymore, but something closer to quicksand. The fog absorbed their panic, deadening the sound, making the disaster feel unreal. Elias watched it all with a stillness that frightened him. He hadn't expected victory to look like this. No fire, no explosions, just nature reclaiming what humans had tried to dominate. Water and soil, old wood and older tides, doing the work silently and without mercy. The fourth Panzer reversed in time, engines screaming as it retreated up the road. The column stalled. The Germans scrambled to reposition, but their formation was broken. Days of advance had been shattered in minutes. Their confidence cracked like the Pasadizo's beams. Elias stepped back on the barrels, breath clouding in front of him. Relief washed through him first, raw, overwhelming. It was followed by something else, something heavier, the weight of what it had caused. Machines had been destroyed. Lives had been altered. War had forced his hand, but the result remained the same. He turned away from the chaos, his legs unsteady as he made his way toward the shoreline. The fog swallowed his figure, just as it had swallowed the tanks. The inlet was quiet again, except for the distant cries of soldiers trying to salvage the unsalvageable. And Elias, anonymous, unseen, kept walking. Dawn arrived reluctantly. It did not break across the inlet in gold or rose. Instead, it seeped in like diluted milk, merged with the fog, until sky and earth became a single pale sheet. Elias stood at the edge of the rocky shore, boots half buried in frost, staring at the horizon where nothing could be seen except colorless emptiness. The wind gnawed at his coat, carrying the faint metallic scent of damaged engines from the inland road. The noise of the collapse had faded hours ago, leaving behind only a hollow, echoing quiet. The village had not fully awakened, but signs of life quivered through the mist. Doors creaked open. A kettle clattered in someone's kitchen. Voices whispered in cautious, disbelieving tones. Word had spread. Something impossible had happened in the night. German tanks, the unstoppable monsters of war, lay trapped in the earth like broken toys. No artillery, no saboteurs from outside, no explosives hidden beneath the soil. Just the inlet itself turning traitor. And somewhere in those hushed conversations, a single name drifted in pieces. Not confirmed, not spoken with certainty, only hinted, half-believed, often like a rumor trying to find shape. Elias remained apart from it all. He sat on an overturned hull near his skiff, rubbing the cold from his knuckles as he checked the nets he had abandoned the day before. The familiar motions steadied him. Not pull, Titan. Not pull, Titan. But every movement felt heavier, weighed down by the memory of cracking beams, collapsing earth, metal sinking beneath mud. What he had done was necessary. He knew that, yet necessity did not blunt the sharp edge left inside him. Footsteps approached from behind, soft and hesitant. Elias didn't need to turn to know someone had spotted him. He continued working until he heard the voice of old Marjakurtu, the baker's widow. "You were out late," she said, her tone probing but gentle. "Some say they saw you near the shipyard." Elias kept his eyes on the net. Fog plays tricks. Her breath puffed in a small cloud. She watched him a long moment. Tricks or not, the inlet seems to have fought back. Machines stronger than houses, stopped like fish in a trap. He tied another knot. "We've had strange tide before." A faint smile tugged her voice. "Strange, yes, but not that strange." She left without pushing further. Others might come later, curious, suspicious, grateful. He wasn't sure which emotion would trouble him more. But for now, the silence returned, leaving Elias alone with the steady rhythm of his hands. He paused eventually, staring across the inlet where the fog hid the broken Panzers. He imagined them stuck in the softening soil, their once gleaming armor now coated in mud, their engines silent. War machines defeated not by force or artillery, but by miscalculation, by underestimating the land and the people who lived closest to it. Germans would try to recover them, of course, but it would take days, maybe longer, and days mattered in war. Days changed everything. The villagers would have time now, time to prepare defenses, time to evacuate the elderly, time to move fishing supplies before the Germans regrouped. A small reprieve, carved out of desperation, and salt water and old wood. Elias lifted his gaze to the hills where his brother once ran traps with him. They had grown up exploring every hidden turn of the inlet, every tide pool, every rotted plank that seemed to move under their weight. His brother had always believed the land took care of its own, if you knew how to listen. Elias had not believed it then. Now he wasn't so sure. Footsteps approached again. This time it was a young boy, Nils, the blacksmith's apprentice. He stood a few paces away, hesitant, cheeks red with cold. "Is it true," Nils asked, "that someone helped the inlet stop the tanks?" Elias looked at him, really looked. At the hope in the boy's eyes, the fear, the dawning belief that maybe the village wasn't as helpless as it had felt yesterday. He wanted to deny it, to fade back into anonymity, to let the fog protect him the way it protected everything else here. Instead, he said nothing. The silence itself became an answer. Nils nodded, as if receiving instructions he didn't need spoken aloud. Then he turned and ran off toward the smithy, eager to share the unspoken truth. Elias remained still, not proud, not ashamed, just present. The fog thickened again, drifting low across the water. It curled around the docks, swallowing footprints, blurring shapes, muting sound. Soon the inlet looked exactly as it had before the tanks arrived. Quiet, isolated, wrapped in the soft veil of winter mist. Only someone who knew the land as deeply as Elias would sense the change beneath the surface. The shifted currents, the awakened channels, the broken earth healing in slow, patient silence. He gathered his nets, walked toward his skiff, placed a hand on the familiar worn wood. The war would continue beyond the inlet. Armies would march. Machines would roar. Maps would be redrawn by people who had never smelled salt on the wind. But here, in this small forgotten corner of the Baltic, an ordinary man had shifted the tide, not through power or rank or weapons, but through understanding. As Elias pushed the skiff into the water, the mist closed in around him once more. The inlet, as if in gratitude, swallowed him gently, hiding him from the world. And by the time the sun fully rose, the tanks remained stuck, the villagers began rebuilding, and only a whispered legend drifted through the cold morning air. That courage can rise from anyone who knows their land better than any army ever will.